The first thing my manager noticed that Monday was the rideshare sticker still stuck to the inside of my coat sleeve. I'd peeled it off the window of the car and it had grabbed onto me like it wanted to come inside and testify. She looked at it, then at me, and right there in front of the whole ops table, she said, "Why are you still catching rides? Where's that truck of yours?" Before I could open my mouth, my husband, sitting 2 seats down because he'd come to walk us through some new leave policy, gave a little laugh and said, "Oh, my brother's got her truck for a while. He needed something to haul with." He said it the way you'd say it's supposed to rain Thursday. Calm, bored almost. Like he hadn't just handed off a $30,000 truck that was titled in my name and my name only. Like he hadn't done it without asking me. Like the keys had always been a community resource, and I was just the one who happened to drive it. My manager didn't say anything for a second, maybe 3 seconds, but I watched her face do something I'll never forget, and what she did after that meeting is the reason I'm sitting here today in a life that is actually mine. I'll get to it. I promise I'll get to it. But you need the whole thing or it won't land right, so let me back up. Let me take you to that driveway. We had a house in a subdivision outside Raleigh, one of those neighborhoods where every third house is the same floor plan flipped backwards. There was an oil stain on the right side of the garage floor, dark and old, shaped a little like the state of Florida. That stain was where my truck lived. A white F-150, 4 years old when the trouble started, paid off in full with money I'd saved myself, plus what was left after I sold my dad's auto shop when he passed. My dad taught me to drive in a truck. He used to say a woman who can back a trailer into a tight spot never has to wait around for a man to do it for her. That truck wasn't a vehicle to me. It was the last thing of his I could still touch. And for about 6 weeks that spring, every morning I'd come down the stairs and look through the little window in the kitchen and see that oil stain with nothing on top of it. Just the dark shape of where the truck used to be. You'd think after a while you'd stop looking. I never stopped looking. It was like running your thumb over the spot where a ring used to sit. The skin remembers even when the thing is gone. It started, the way these things always seem to, over something small enough to feel ridiculous if you said it out loud. His brother had a landscaping side gig he was always about to make real money on. Always about to. He'd been driving some beat-up SUV that finally died in a Lowe's parking lot, and one Saturday morning my husband came out to the garage where I was changing the oil myself. I always did my own oil. My dad would have haunted me otherwise, and he leaned on the doorframe and said his brother had a big job lined up. Mulch and pavers, real money this time, and could he borrow the truck? Just for a couple weeks, until he got back on his feet. I remember wiping my hands on the rag and feeling that little drop in my stomach. Not because I'm selfish, because I knew. Some part of me already knew that a couple weeks was a door, not a destination. "I kind of need it for work," I said, "and it's the only thing of Dad's I've got left. You know that." And my husband got this look. I wish I could describe it to you exactly. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier. It was disappointment, soft and patient. The look of a man who is so much more reasonable than the woman in front of him and is sad to have to point it out. "Wow," he said. "Okay, after everything my family's done for us, you can't loan a truck for 2 weeks." And there it was. Everything my family's done for us. His parents had covered our earnest money and then handed us another chunk to clear my student loans when we got married. $52,000 all told. That number lived in our house like a third person. It came to dinner. It came to every disagreement. Whenever I tried to set even the smallest boundary. When his mother called at 10 at night about nothing and I let it go to voicemail. When I said I didn't want to spend a 4th Christmas in a row at their place. The 52,000 would walk into the room and sit down between us. And I'd feel like the ungrateful one. The one keeping score. The one who took and took. So I gave him the keys. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was being difficult. I caught a rideshare to work that Monday. I told my manager the truck was in the shop. I'm not proud of the lying. The lies were just smaller than the truth, and the truth was too embarrassing to say out loud. 2 weeks came and went. His brother had one more job. Then the truck needed new brakes his brother was going to put on himself, which meant I couldn't even drive it on the weekend. Then his brother just stopped mentioning it. And so did my husband, and I learned that if I brought it up, I'd get the look again, and I was so tired of the look. You have to understand, by then, I was tired of a lot of things. Because the truck wasn't really the start, the truck was just the part you could see from the road. The smaller erasures had been going for years. I used to do the finances. Somewhere along the line, he took that off my plate and I stopped getting the logins. I used to keep my own checking account from before the marriage, and one day he'd sat me down with a spreadsheet and explained how much simpler everything would be if we consolidated, and I'd nodded along, and a few months later I noticed my name had quietly moved to second on every account. He'd reorganized the contacts in my phone once when he was cleaning it up, and my best friend, who I'd known since we were 19, had ended up buried in a folder while his mother sat pinned at the top. Little things. The kind of thing that sounds like nothing when you list it, but you stack up enough nothings, and one morning you're standing at a kitchen window in your own house, looking at an empty oil stain, and you realize you can't remember the last time you made a decision that stuck. That's what disappearing actually feels like, in case anyone's ever told you it's dramatic. It isn't dramatic at all. It's quiet. It's polite. It's 1,000 reasonable little surrenders, each one too small to plant your flag on, until you look up and there's almost nothing left of the woman who used to back a trailer into a tight spot without breaking a sweat. By the morning of that ops meeting, I'd been catching rides for 6 weeks. My husband, who used to drive in with me, we worked at the same company, him running HR, me running operations on the distribution side, had stopped offering. Just stopped. He'd started going in at 6 for early calls, which left me to figure out my own way at 7:30, and when I asked him once, gently, if he could just wait the extra 90 minutes a couple days a week, he'd looked at me over his coffee and said, "I can't structure my whole career around your schedule." And I'd let it drop, because that's what I did. I let things drop. So picture me that Monday. I'd Ubered in. $11 I didn't love spending. I had that sticker on my sleeve. And my manager, who was one of the sharpest people I've ever worked for, a woman about 50 with reading glasses she wore on a chain and absolutely no patience for nonsense, looked at me across the table and asked where my truck was. And my husband answered for me, "My brother's got her truck for a while." The room went a particular kind of quiet, the kind where everybody's suddenly very interested in their notepads. My manager set her pen down. She didn't look at him. She looked at me and she said, "Real even. Walk with me when we're done here." We finished the agenda. I don't remember a word of it. When everyone filed out, she shut her office door and gestured at the chair and just looked at me for a long moment. And then she said, "I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to answer it like I'm not your boss. Did you say yes to that?" And I opened my mouth to give her the easy version, the "it's fine" version, and instead what came out was, "Not really." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." And then she said something that I've turned over in my head 100 times since. She said, "I've watched you shrink for 2 years. I kept thinking you were just busy. I should have said something sooner." I started crying in her office. I'm not a crier. I cried anyway. Here's the thing about my manager, and the thing my husband didn't count on. She didn't fix it for me. She didn't call his brother or call him or make a scene. What she did was slower and 100 times more powerful. She said, "When someone takes something that's legally yours and dares you to make a fuss about it, that's not a marriage problem. Sometimes it's a marriage problem. But sometimes it's a pattern, and patterns show up at work too." She paused. "Has anything felt off with your reviews lately?" And I sat there, and a year of small confusion suddenly lined up in a row. Because something had felt off. The year before, I'd been up for director slot. I'd run the warehouse consolidation under budget. I'd cleaned up our carrier contracts. I had the numbers. And the promotion had gone to a guy from procurement who golfed with my husband, and when I'd asked for feedback, the answer had been vague. Concerns about your leadership presence, some peer feedback we'd want to see improve, and I'd swallowed it and told myself I'd do better. Because that's what I did. I told my manager about it. She got very still. Then she said, "Reviews route through HR for archiving. Your husband's HR." She let that sit. I'm not saying anything yet, but I'm going to ask compliance to pull some records, and I'm going to ask compliance to pull some records, and I'm going to do it through channels that don't run past his desk. And you're going to talk to someone who isn't me. That afternoon, I didn't go home. I went to my best friend's place instead, the friend who'd been buried in my phone, and I sat at her kitchen counter and told her all of it. The truck and the accounts and the reviews and the $52,000 that walked into every fight. And she listened the whole way through without once telling me I was overreacting. When I finished, she was quiet for a second, and then she said the words I think I'd been waiting 6 years for someone to say. "Honey, that's not him being inconsiderate. That's financial abuse. He's been doing your finances so you can't see them, and he gave away the one thing in your name that he couldn't touch on paper. He knew exactly what he was doing." I wanted to argue. I genuinely did. But I'd run his finance spreadsheet over and over in my own head, and I couldn't make it come out any other way. She made me stay. That part matters, and I want to say it plainly because I see how these stories usually go. She would not let me go home and have it out with him face to face. "Whatever you do," she said, "you do not stand in that kitchen and confront him alone. People like that don't take losing control well. You are not going to be a cautionary tale. You're going to be smart, and you're going to be boring about it, and boring is what wins." So I was boring about it. I slept in her guest room. The next morning, I called the family law attorney she'd found me, a woman named Marisol Vega with a calm, flat, lethal way of talking, and I sat in her office and laid the whole thing out. What Marisol told me changed the temperature in my body. "First," she said, "the truck. You bought it with separate funds before and outside the marriage, titles in your name only. In North Carolina, that's separate property. He had no right to lend it, and you can demand it back today. We'll send the letter." She wrote something down. "Second, the accounts. We're going to inventory everything, and we're going to do it before he knows you're looking." And then she asked the question that cracked the whole thing open. "Has he ever opened anything in your name? Credit card, loan, line of credit?" I said I didn't think so. I said I'd know. She just looked at me, the way Marisol looked at people, and said, "Pull your credit report before you leave today. Free. Takes 10 minutes. I pulled it on my phone in her parking lot, and there it was. A credit card I had never applied for, opened 18 months earlier. My name, my social, an address that wasn't ours. It was his mother's address. With a balance just over $19,000. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. I got very calm, the way you do when something is finally making sense. 18 months. Right around when his brother's side gig had needed seed money. Right around when his mother had redone her kitchen. Marisol was almost cheerful when I called her back. "That's not a marriage problem," she said. "That's identity theft, and it's fraud, and it is going to be the best thing that ever happened to your case. Here's what we do. You file an identity theft report with the FTC today. You file a police report. You dispute every charge. Done right, you are not liable for $1 of that debt. It's his, and the paper trail proves it. Anybody who tells you a wife has to split her own husband's fraud down the middle doesn't know the law." I did all of it that afternoon. The FTC report, the police report, the disputes. I felt my hand shaking the whole time, and underneath the shaking, for the first time in years, I felt something with weight to it. I felt like a person who was doing something instead of a person things were happening to. Meanwhile, at work, the records came back. My manager called me into a conference room with 2 people I'd never met from compliance, and a folder, and she slid the folder across to me the way you'd hand someone a diagnosis. My promotion review the year before. My husband had downgraded the scores, not the original committee's marks. He'd gone in the system, and lowered my leadership ratings and added a line about peer concerns that no peer had ever raised and saved it as the official record. The guy who golfed with him had gotten my job on a review my own husband had doctored. And it wasn't just me. Compliance had pulled a wider sample once they knew what they were looking at. There were two other people whose ratings had quietly slid down over a couple cycles, both of them folks who'd pushed back on him in meetings. There was a harassment complaint. A young woman in accounting had filed 8 months back that had never gone anywhere. It had landed on his desk and simply evaporated because the man she complained about was a buddy of his. "This is a pattern of falsifying records and burying reports," one of the compliance people said. "It's serious, it's potentially fraud, and it touches several people." I sat there holding the folder, and I thought, I married this man. I made him coffee. I gave him the keys to my dad's truck. And the whole time he was a thumb on a scale, pressing down on everyone who ever inconvenienced him, including me, especially me. They gave him a choice, the way companies do: resign and walk, or be terminated for cause, which meant they'd have to report certain things to the boards that license HR professionals, which meant he might never work in his field again. He chose to resign. Of course he did. Men like him always pick the door that leaves the least paperwork. He found out about the divorce filing the same week. I did not serve him myself, and I did not tell him to his face. Marisol handled it. He got served at his mother's, the same house where my fraudulent credit card had been mailing its statements for a year and a half. He called me at 11 that night. I almost didn't pick up. I did on speaker in my friend's guest room with her standing in the doorway as my witness. His voice was a thing I didn't recognize, raw and wounded and reaching. 6 years, he said. You're throwing away 6 years over a truck. And I remember saying, quietly, because I wasn't scared of him anymore, and you don't have to shout when you're not scared, it was never about the truck. You know, it was never about the truck. He told me his mother was devastated. He told me I was being manipulated by people at my job. He told me I'd regret blowing up our family. He brought up the $52,000 right on cue, and for the first time in my entire marriage, that number walked into the room and I looked at it and felt absolutely nothing. His parents had given us that money. He had used it for years as a leash. That was a choice he'd made, not a debt I owed. "I hope you get some help," I said, and I hung up. The divorce took 8 months and he fought every inch of it, which Marisol had warned me he would. He hired a lawyer who tried to argue the truck was marital, tried to argue I'd agreed to the credit card by being married to him, tried to claim the house equity was mostly his parents' money, so mostly his. None of it held. The truck was mine. Full stop. And his brother brought it back to a neutral lot the day after the demand letter arrived, suddenly very respectful of the title. The credit card debt was assigned to him, every dollar, with the fraud documentation right there in the file. The retirement got split fair. I kept what was mine and walked away from what wasn't worth fighting for, including a house I'd never really felt at home in anyway. His family went through their phases. First, I was the villain. His mother sent me a long message about loyalty and about everything they'd done for us. A couple of his cousins unfriended me. There was a stretch where I'd open social media and feel my stomach drop. Then slowly, the story they'd built started running into the facts. The fraud, the doctored reviews, the resignation. About 6 months after the divorce was final, his sister-in-law, his brother's wife, who'd never been anything but kind to me, sent me a note that just said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked you instead of believing him." I cried over that one too. People surprise you in both directions. I got the director's job that fall. The real one this time, with the title and the parking spot and a review process that nobody could reach into and edit. My manager, the woman who set her pen down and said, "Walk with me," handed me the offer letter herself and said, "I've been waiting 2 years to do this." I keep that letter in my desk. On bad days, I read it. The truck sits in my driveway now, at a little house I bought on my own on a street where I know my neighbors' names. The oil stain on my new garage floor is fresh and small and entirely mine. I changed the oil myself the first weekend I moved in, and I sat on the bumper afterward with my hands smelling like my dad's whole life, and I let myself feel how far back I'd come. I met someone eventually, and I almost don't want to talk about him because it feels like the kind of tidy ending these stories tack on. But it's true, so I'll tell you. He's a guy my friend introduced me to, builds custom cabinetry, has sawdust in his truck and the patience of a man who measures twice. The first time he saw me hauling lumber in my F-150, he didn't offer to do it for me. He just grabbed the other end. That's the whole test, honestly. There are men who want to take the weight so you'll owe them, and there are men who just grab the other end. It took me 40 years and one terrible marriage to learn to tell the difference. I ran into my ex about a year after everything settled, a hardware store, of all places, on a Sunday. He'd put on weight and gone gray at the temples, and he had a careful, deflated look to him, like a man walking on a floor he no longer trusts. He saw me before I saw him, and for a second I think he considered pretending he hadn't. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. We stood there in the plumbing aisle, two strangers who'd once shared a name and a mortgage. He told me he was at a smaller company now, not in HR anymore, doing something in operation support. He told me, stiff and rehearsed, that he'd been seeing somebody to work on things, that his counselor said he had control issues, that he hadn't been a good partner. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to truth I'd ever heard come out of his mouth, and I found I didn't need it to be more than it was. "I hope it helps," I said, and I meant it. That surprised me, that I meant it. He looked at me for a second and asked in a small voice, "Are you happy?" I thought about my little house and my fresh oil stain and the man who grabs the other end of the lumber and the team I run now and the review process nobody can reach into. I thought about the morning I'd stood at the kitchen window, staring at where my truck used to be, feeling myself thin out into nothing. "Yeah," I said, "I really am." He nodded, and something in his face came loose just for a second. "Good," he said. "That's good. You deserve that." I watched him walk away down the aisle, this man who'd once organized my whole life out from under me, now just a guy buying a faucet washer on a Sunday. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel triumphant, which is what I'd expected to feel. I just felt light. I felt like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed up so long I'd forgotten it had air. People ask me sometimes. My friend asks me. My new guy has asked me if I regret how long it took. 6 years. Longer, if you count the slow part, the polite surrenders, the 1,000 small nothings. And I tell them the honest answer, which is that I don't regret leaving. I regret how long it took me to look at that empty oil stain and finally say, out loud, to one person who'd listen, "This isn't okay, and I shouldn't have to make myself smaller to keep the peace." Because that's the lie at the center of the whole thing. The one I'd believed so long I mistook it for love. The lie is that peace is something you buy by handing over pieces of yourself, a little at a time until there's nothing left to give and they're still holding out their hand. That's not peace. That's just a quiet kind of disappearing. Real peace, it turns out, comes from the opposite direction. It comes from the boundary you finally hold. It comes from the truck in your own driveway, the accounts with your name back at the top, the life nobody can edit when you're not looking. It comes from learning, late in my case, but not too late, that the right people don't need you to shrink to feel comfortable standing next to you. They just grab the other end and lift. For the longest time, I told myself that keeping the peace was a kind of goodness, that a decent woman bends, absorbs, lets the small things slide so the people she loves stay comfortable. I learned the hard way that there's a difference between being good and being afraid, and that I'd spent 6 years confusing the two. The morning I stood at that kitchen window, staring at the empty oil stain where my truck used to sit, I wasn't being patient. I was disappearing, one quiet surrender at a time, and every surrender taught the man across the table that the next one would be easier to take. That's the part I want you to really sit with, because it's the whole machine. Nothing my husband did happened all at once. He didn't steal my truck, he borrowed it, and I let him, and the letting is what gave him the next inch and the next. By the time he opened a credit card in my name at his mother's address, he wasn't taking a risk anymore. He'd already learned from 100 small tests that I wouldn't look. Cause and effect. Every boundary I didn't hold became permission. What turned it around wasn't rage and it wasn't luck. It was finally choosing to see clearly instead of comfortably. When my best friend told me to stay at her place instead of marching home to have it out, the old me wanted to argue. The smarter part of me listened because she was right. You don't confront someone who's been quietly controlling you by walking alone into his kitchen. You get clever. You pull your credit report. You call someone like Marisol. You write everything down and you let the paper do the shouting. Doing the careful, boring, unglamorous thing is what kept me safe and kept me whole. And none of it would have mattered if I hadn't found the nerve to actually move. Knowing the truth and surviving it are two different muscles. There were nights I wanted to drop the whole thing just to make the phone calls and the guilt stop. The strength to keep going, to file, to dispute, to sit across from him in mediation and not flinch, wasn't something I was born with. I built it the way you build anything, by doing the next hard thing and then the one after that. I think about my boss sometimes, how she set her pen down and said, "Walk with me." She didn't owe me that. She did it because she was the kind of person who won't look away from something wrong, even when looking away would have been easier. That's the thing worth becoming. Be honest enough to refuse the comfortable lie, level-headed enough to act with a plan instead of your panic, and stubborn enough to finish what you start. The oil stain in my garage now is small and fresh and entirely mine. So is everything else.